Welcome Kashi and Birju back to Physics of Pranayama channel, the place for left-brained, right-thinking people. And the two of you, the two of you are the epitome of left-brain, right-thinking. You know, you guys are trained technologists from one of the top schools in the world, the Indian Institute of Technology. And unfortunately, one of us is from Kharagpur, but we can't do anything about that.
Fortunately, the oldest IIT, mother of all IITs.
Yes, but think about it, Birju. We all had single digit IIT B, IIT D, IIT M, IIT K, and you guys had like KGP. Like, what's up with that?
We started it, that's why. We were the trendsetters, first ones.
Right. So over the years, you guys have been trained to think analytically and clearly and rationally. And over the years, we've also learned the esoteric way of thinking, the holistic, the all-inclusive, the meditative, like that. And the misconception is that spirituality is usually all loosey-goosey and non-rigorous stuff, but science is this whole rigorous thing. So I thought we would start off there. And I did a coin toss in my head, and I said, the person with the longer hair goes first, and there's like no.
That's Kashi, definitely.
Right. So Kashi, could you speak on that? Like this misconception of spirituality being all loosey goosey.
Actually, I think a lot of times this concept comes from the Occident. In the Occident, spirituality and science were always at loggerheads. Whereas in the Orient, it was actually one and the same thing. In fact, the word rishi comes from drishtara iti rishayah, the one who sees, one who perceives. So actually, the spirituality of the Orient really talks about experiencing and like validating our own experience. So, for example, the whole premise of Nyaya Shastra is about how do I know that what I know is true or not? My eyes are seeing the sunrise. How do I know whether that's true or not? So, even to that level, Western science and Eastern spirituality actually have such commonalities. So, I would say that because of the current literature that looks at the Occidental view of spirituality, that's where in the English language we find this dichotomy. Whereas when it comes to the Sanskrit, this thing, it's actually one and the same.
Right.
In fact, like the tools of yoga actually talk about how we can use the power of the consciousness, the power of our awareness, and hone that to such a sharpness that we are able to perceive much more than what we are with our senses. So the ancient rishis actually used what could have been called mumbo jumbo, but actually developed it to such a degree that it could be a perfectly valid scientific tool for investigation.
Right. So I think coming back to Birju, science, so-called rigorous, etc. So like Kashi gave a counter example to this myth of spirituality all hocus pocus. So can you also give a counter example of where so-called science is really pseudo?
Well, I would not say pseudo, but the process of science is not scientific. The way in which, if you enter a grad school, if you say, okay, I'm going to enter to do this research, there's no guarantee, okay, there's this method, follow ABC steps in order to get success. It may succeed, it may not succeed. You do it, you give it a shot. It is trial and error. I mean, if you look at it on the other end, I mean, to some extent, I do agree that spirituality, the so-called New Age spirituality, which has been popularized by the media today, especially in the US, it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of rigor, compared to the traditional Indian perspectives or the Eastern perspectives, where the integration of the attitude was very much based in experience, like Kashi said. So, modern spirituality, I would agree, the American spirituality, so-called, New Age spirituality, I totally agree that it is loosey goosey, and it is, I personally, it is my button, you know. But
But
in
Birju,
terms
wait,
of
wait.
science,
Birju, hang on. But you also have another button where, you poo-pah all these string theorists and loop quantum gravity, and these are like cutting-edge science, and you think that, oh, wait a minute,
it
it's
is
not
not
rigorous
cutting edge
enough.
science. It
It's
is
not
not
rigorous
science.
enough, right?
It is not science. I mean, uh, I'll tell you, I trained with the leading string theorists and quantum gravity physicists of the world back in the day when these things were forming. And one of the three founders of string theory, Ashok Sen, he came to Penn State to give a course to Abhay Ashtekar. Abhay Ashtekar was another founder of quantum gravity, loop quantum gravity at that time. There were 4 or 5 people in the course. One of them was Abhay Ashtekar, another was me, and another two other grad students, three other grad students. So we had very close interactions for 1 year. Every day we used to have all these discussions, and I had to do a term paper. So I wanted to do some term paper, and I went and had a discussion on electromagnetism in n-dimensional spaces. And Ashok Sen, like at the end of discussion, he was frustrated. He was like, "Look, if you are interested in the real world, this is not the field for you. If you are interested in experiments, if you are interested in testing what is real, what can be tested, this is not the field for you. If you like mathematics, if you really enjoy just mathematics and imagination, then this is the field for you." So string theory is a great, wonderful, beautiful field of mathematics, but not of physics. That's his own, the founder of string theory, my teacher, Ashok Sen, his opinion, not my opinion.
Not
I'm
really.
just, and I've got disillusioned. I left. I said, okay, forget it. I don't want to be in this.
So
On the
maybe,
contrary, loop quantum gravity, Ashok Sen and the other school, they really tried to marry the mathematical rigor with the experimental foundations, empirical foundations of physics, which the last century had a great success. Uh, so, I
but
mean, I
yeah,
can
right,
go on and on, but
right, right. So it all comes down to, in my opinion, the way I'm listening to both of you, one of it is, it's like in Jerry Maguire, how he says, "Show me the money." So show me the data, show me something I can touch and feel, then I will believe it. But what I can interpret, and if I cannot rationalize it, and if my experience cannot be duplicated independently by someone else, then I call it loosey goosey. Is that a good understanding?
yeah, I could say that.
Yeah, I guess definitely. I mean, if it's something that is very subjective, so here one more thing is that not necessary that all knowledge has to be objective. There can be a subjective knowledge. In fact, a lot of times the observer does influence the observation. And that doesn't mean that the observation is in any way of no use. So I would say that subjective knowledge is also useful and objective knowledge is also useful. And maybe they don't correspond at all the times. So if we go to the basis of how do I know, and this is where our ancient rishis really were masters. They did so many intellectual gymnastics that I think no yogi of today would actually be up to form, up to match them truly.
Yeah, that's what Birju also, in one of his posts, he had said something about disciplined imagination. Remember that, Birju?
That's a
Feynman's, yeah.
nice word.
Yeah, so disciplined imagination. So the way I understand it, the yogis had disciplined imagination. They could figure out what intuition was right and what was Brahm or disillusionment. There was a way to discern that. And from what I understand from Birju is that the leading scientists also have this. They have this intuitive leap that they take, and then they have a rigorous way of validating whether that leap is proper or improper. So Birju, can you give us an example of this intuitive, what do you call it? Disciplined intuition.
Disciplined imagination.
Ah,
Yeah.
imagination, right. Yeah.
See, I mean, any progress in science is a leap, right? So there are at two levels. So one is at the level of an experiment. The design of the experiment it involves imagination. So like for example, 20 years ago, uh, you know, 18 years ago, I had when I got after I got disillusioned with this, I was like, okay, what I want to do something tangible. So there was one of the professors at Penn State. He was doing quantum computing. So he had this idea that I'm going to have 25 atoms, or 10 atoms, or 25 atoms, or some X number of atoms in an array, cubical array, 555 or 10, 1,000 atoms, or 125 atoms, whatever we can have in a cubical array in a laser trap in vacuum, and we're going to do this quantum computing operations. Uh, this takes imagination. Like if at that time the idea of trapping atoms was already, like, it was, people could trap single atoms or a cloud of atoms, but to break it up into a lattice and to say, okay, I'm going to make this interact, that's like, now you have imagination, that's not enough. I had to do 2 years of calculations just to have, okay, what bandwidth of laser, all those things, right? So the details of it, we had to very precisely, we say, okay, we had to, this just got done last year. It took
Yeah, I heard about that.
19 years of effort, 18 years of effort, some long time of focused discipline, ruling out, okay, correcting, ruling out. So you need imagination, and you need a self correction mechanism. And in, you know we have I think Kashi can refer the shloka, but we have pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. We say in the spirituality, in the Vedic, in a yogic tradition also, it is not like you just take something for granted. You question it and systematically inquire it, and you have to have praman. You have to give a certain reference for it. You have to have a debate. And Adi Shankara's whole thing was all, he had very systematic, very refined debates, philosophical debates, very precise. So, and experiment. Like, you also have to prayog. We have the word prayog, that which leads to yoga.
Right.
So, in that sense,
Right. So hang on, Birju. So Kashi, so there is a disconnect, right? So what Birju said, he designed an experiment, then he was independently able to validate it by, I don't know, X number of calculations, etc. And then someone else can duplicate what Birju did and said, all right, what Birju did was correct. Now for the spiritual side, let's say we have an experience or a realization. If someone else can't duplicate that, then there is no independent verification. So what is the process of like validating an experience or invalidating an experience in the spiritual side?
So I don't think that truly speaking, I don't think that truly speaking, a subjective experience can be evaluated with the parameters of an objective experience. Obviously, when we change the paradigm, obviously when we change the experiment, then you need to change the parameters too. So in that sense, the ancient rishis had this amazing idea that subjective experience can be validated subjectively, and objective experience can be validated objectively. And so there were a lot of there's a lot of examples of objective experience validation. For example, the whole of the Vaisheshika Darshana talks about the structure of matter, the structure of existence. And it's a very beautiful definition. It says, Kanada, the Rishi Kanada, he describes, if you take any substance and you keep splitting it into halves, the smallest portion which exhibits the same quality as the whole is called an anu. And if you keep splitting it below that, then it's called Parmanu. So it's a very beautiful definition. And this definition is there in Sanskrit, and it's something that's available in the texts that are so ancient, which is such a beautiful definition of what physics today talks about as
Ah,
molecules and atoms and
right.
subatomic particles. Just the fact that they had words to describe these phenomena shows that they were familiar with these concepts. And I think that's how we see this objective validation being existing in our standard, so to speak, flow of language. At the same time, subjective evaluation was always the guru shishya parampara, that a student would go to a guru and the guru would validate the experience.
Huh.
Because subjective experience is subjective by definition,
Right.
you need to evaluate it subjectively. And a lit candle can light other candles. So, in that sense, someone who's had that experience can validate a subjective experience. So, I think that's where the beauty of the Eastern thought, the philosophy, was that it did not reject any aspect of learning. And every aspect of knowledge got integrated into one whole structure. Whereas, so there's no room for dogma here. The way I look at it, a lot of Western thought has a lot of dogma. If you don't believe either my way or highway,
Right.
and I
Yeah.
think that's where the Eastern philosophies were so inclusive. Like you could have people as disparate as the Charvakas who said, "Hey, there's nothing existent, just eat, drink, and be merry," and they could coexist with people who are saying that it's all Advaita. There's nothing. There's only consciousness. So I think this plurality of thought is something that is unique to the Oriental mysticism, the Oriental philosophies, and I love the rigor of the Western thought. Of course, the experimentation, the kind of the way I look at it is that Western systems of philosophy of science actually find a place in the Eastern philosophy, but it's actually like a subset of the Eastern philosophy is what I'd like to
Yeah.
perceive it as.
Yeah, that's very nice. So, yeah, that reminds me on something that I said just spontaneously on one of the courses. I said, question everything goes hand in hand with reject nothing. Both have to go together. We stop at half of it. We question
Yeah.
everything, but we don't, we reject everything else. Then it doesn't go together. Question everything goes hand in hand with reject nothing. That is very nicely you said that you got to validate your subjective experience by someone else who is either already had that subjective experience or is at a higher level of your consciousness than you are, and he can validate then, oh, this is Brahm and this is correct, this way. He doesn't reject anything. He says you had that experience. Now I'm just going to put it in perspective for you. That's the guru. That's so beautiful. So coming back to these stories, right? So in Kashi, I don't remember exactly what the story is, but there is a story where, um, let's say, okay, before we get to the story, can you just define for us what is these three words that people use very loosey-goosey way? Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And there is this another word called Tatva, and it's used highly interchangeably. So we need to define it. So could you please?
So a lot of this imaginary comes from the Puranas. So you'll find that in the Vedic texts, you'll hardly find any reference to Brahma, Vishnu, or Shiva. But most of these references come from the Puranas. And Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar ji defines the Purana very beautifully. He says, Pure Nava iti Purana, that which is new in town. So a story like this actually illustrates something. When a finger points to the moon, if I keep looking at the finger, I never get to the moon. But if I keep looking where the finger is pointing, that's when I obtain the moon. So all of these stories are like the finger that points to the moon. When people take it literally, then they get stuck with the finger and they don't reach the moon. So you need to really look at where it's moving. And that's why these analogies of Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, just like any analogy, when you look at the what that analogy is referring to, that's when we really find it useful. As a story, all of these three characters, all of these three ideas, all of these three depictions form a very rich storytelling base. And so there are a lot of stories that can come up. There are from each of these Puranas that talk about Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But the way Gurudev interprets some of the interpretations, one, he says it's like the generator, operator, and destroyer. The whole of existence, you'll find that there is, in any process, there's input, processing, and output. And so, which is in a generic definition, any process has these three aspects, which we can boil it down to that. And unless we have all these three, the process is incomplete. So, in a certain sense, these three energies actually represent that. And of course, when you add the word Tatva to anything, that makes it a principle. And so I think that's where Brahma, as Lord Brahma, becomes an image, and then it has a personality, it does something, actions attributed. But when it becomes Brahma Tattva, Vishnu Tattva, and Shiva Tattva, it becomes the whole principle. The principle that in this whole universe, there's something that's maintaining the order, there's something which is transforming this order, and there's something which is creating this order in the first place. So I think these are the three aspects that we find in the whole of creation. So the word tattva is actually attached with many things to illustrate this, to transform a story into a principle, to go from the analogy to the essence.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Birju, on the science side, obviously things
What do
are,
you mean on the science side?
no, 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 no. No, 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 no. Okay, wrong, wrong. Scratch that, scratch that. Not on the science side. From your point of view, Birju, things have to be created, things are maintained, and then things get transformed. And there are various rules in physics that allow you to do that, like energy will be created and transformed from here and there. They came up with this so-called God particle because they didn't understand how does something have mass, like inertia. Nobody understood inertia till, like, how does mass happen before inertia happens? All this. So can you put it in perspective? What Kashi said
We
from
still
the
don't we still don't understand where mass happens, but that's but
It
that's
happens from chocolate cake, actually.
chocolate.
I have total experience of that. Every time I come to US, there's a lot of mass that accumulates,
So that is just
and it
transformation.
brings
That is just transformation. It goes from one place to the other. Never
and it
gets
brings inertia.
any inertia. Yeah,
that is a topological mass, surface mass. It accumulates on the surface. um, something fascinating when I learned quantum field theory, there is this whole there was this whole shift when they tried to make quantum mechanics consistent with special relativity. There was a guy called Dirac, Paul Dirac. He inspired Feynman actually at that time. This was like 100 years ago, maybe 80, 90 years ago. So Paul Dirac came up with this idea that you have vacuum. Actually, this was a little bit after Paul Dirac. His idea was a little bit more crude, but eventually the idea culminated as the whole basis of quantum field theory. If you try to make quantum mechanics consistent with relativity, the only way to do it is to say that the number of particles, electrons and positrons, uh, you know, is not conserved. So means the number is indefinite. That means you will have zero particles, vacuum, out of which you will create something. You propagate it in time, and that propagation is through it's called an operator, mathematical operator called energy or Hamiltonian operator. So it propagates in time and then it gets annihilated. So there's a creation operator, propagation, time propagation operator, and there's an annihilation operator. And so when I learned this, it was fascinating for me. It's like there is an analogy in the way our creation manifest creation, and these are all these particles, everything that we see, it is considered a set of virtual particles. Now, how does the virtual appear real? This is a conundrum. We don't know. Before that, we have to understand consciousness. We don't know what that is, how that is. But all of it is so. in science, to come back to your question, it's like in the physics, modern physics, this this process of creation, uh, propagation, and annihilation, this is a very fundamental process, very basic mathematical process, and there's no, luckily there is no person associated with them. They did not make stories which were confusing to, I don't know, I have a personal dislike. This is my another button which is like, it would have been better if they had not put the image, like, but at some level they had to do it. Like for children, you cannot say creation operator, you have to say some, make up some story. So this is meant for children, but then the grown-ups started taking it seriously and started fighting over it, probably. But it's okay.
Okay, all right. So, there is this, Kashi, there is this thing called Purusha and Prakriti. So, Purusha is the unmanifest and Prakriti is the manifest, etc. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, I think uh, when we look at her whole existence, it very clearly delineates into all that is manifest, like a physical uh, manifestation, and there is something that makes all of that manifest. So there is a cause of that. So when we look at, say, even if I press a switch to turn the light on, the bulb lights up. It's the bulb that's lighting up, that's manifest. The electricity actually makes it light up. So that's a little subtler. And me pressing the switch is the cause for that manifestation. So essentially, the Vedic thought looked at this whole existence and said there is the in its own words, the gross, the subtle, and the karana, or the cause. So these are the three aspects which determine the whole of creation. And so a cause is always unmanifest. So even if I have a material cause, so if I say that I am the person who pressed the switch, then I can do the whole process with the same me.
Uh-huh.
So I'm the result. So if we keep going back, what is it that's the ultimate cause? There's a cause that doesn't have an a cause that doesn't have an is not built on an effect, so to speak. So when we keep so it's more of a thought experiment. When we look at it like that, then we come to this conclusion: there is some ultimate cause which is not caused by anything else. Like often when children ask the question, who is God, and you answer something, then they said, who is it that created that? And though that seems to be a very childish question, it's actually the most profound question to actually go into this whole process of who did it and who did it and where does the buck stop. I think where the buck stops is called the Purusha, and everything else is the
It's
Prakriti.
the Prakriti, right? Birju, same thing is happening on your side of the fence. I'm not going to use science now. I'm going to see.
You can use whatever you want.
I
I
can
just
use
like to
whatever
have
I
a
want.
laugh.
Yeah, yeah. So, Birju, same thing is happening on this whole quest for this so-called theory of everything, or the grand unification. What caused this? What caused this? And you go back, 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 and then the math becomes very fuzzy. But could you explain the process of how people went back and then they merged those four fundamental forces into two, and then eventually those two will merge into one, hopefully one day?
Well, there are many books and videos available on that, so that's a well-known fact now. I mean, people know about this, but I think the thing that people miss often is the the magic of unification was when Faraday and Maxwell, when Maxwell understood or realized that magnetism and electricity are two sides of the same coin.
Same coin, right? Yeah.
This is a little appreciated unification. Uh, this was the first breakthrough which changed the face of science,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
Because of that insight, we understood how light propagates. Because of that, all of that we see today, we are able to communicate because of that insight,
Right.
which is understanding that you have electricity on one hand, and you have magnetism, you have those little magnets. and they fundamentally arise from the same field. They're two faces of the same field, and that is something which should excite and fascinate, and it's energize, uh, if you understand it, if you appreciate it,
But that
and
is
that
physics
is of
too. I
more
mean,
value than
we went through physics too, kicking and screaming.
it is. It is amazing. It is amazing how deep that one thing is. That just so. Then other things, of course, then you go to the nuclear level. Even the idea that things are made of atoms. This is a tremendously unifying idea. And that one idea, along with this electricity and magnetism, the idea that uh, in order to influence something, you don't have to touch it. There has to some empty space. There is nothing in that empty space, but you have a charge here, you have a charge there. That property of that charge itself, it will influence the other thing. In between, there is nothing, and then that is in the physical space, and then there are other subtler spaces. So that is where the strong unification and the weak force and the strong force and the all those things come in, where the electromagnetic force lives in this particular type of space, a particular type of interaction, and there are other spaces, other ways of interactions, which do not uh, which you cannot imagine, you cannot
Would it
picture.
be appropriate to call it different scales, Birju? Like they operate at different
They do
dimensions or
they
scales?
they do operate at different scales, but they also different operate in different spaces. Like
They operate on the right side of the fence, Kashi, versus the left side of the fence. It's like different spaces.
no, it is okay. How do I say this? So there's something called a group. Without going into the mathematics, it's hard to really describe these things. So I had to think about it, how to describe in a simple term. But
Don't
uh,
worry, don't worry, Birju.
yeah.
I know it's complicated because I mean, we should not trivialize it. It is quite complicated stuff. And
It is very deep. That's why I'm saying just the electricity, we take this for granted. An electron in an atom, it goes around. This is the first thing people learn in high school or something. Electron is going around. That going around creates a magnetic moment
yeah, yeah,
in the atom itself. And the electron itself has a magnetic moment. Now, electron is a point particle.
yeah,
How does it have a magnetic moment? How
yeah.
does it spin around? We say electron is a spin. But how can a point spin around itself? And it has both a charge and a magnetic field, and both these fields are not actually different. They are two aspects of the same bigger field. Just this much, if we appreciate, that is enough to blow our mind. The other thing you can
Doesn't
go
have
into.
doesn't have zero mass also?
No,
Like
no, actually,
just
the electron is a very tiny mass. It's like 9 times 10 to the minus 31 kilogram. Very, very small. About 1,000 times less than a proton.
So
so
Birju,
it
okay,
can't be a
so
point product.
can't be a, but okay, fine. So is
Is
there any
not
fundamental reason that, or is it just a convention that we just call the electron negative? We could have very well called it positive and everything would still fit,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? But it's so amazing that we
Absolutely, yeah.
call it negative. And then we also on the other side other side of the fence, we say at the core of our being is positivity, joy, happiness, and on the surface is all negativity. It's highly consistent with the model of the atom. If the electron is negative, it's on the outside. So is this just like by chance, or is there like a deeper rule to it?
I have no
Hey
comment.
Kashi, that's the first. I mean, Birju is at loss for words, man. That's
I,
amazing.
I don't want to say anything because the person who said that, I mean, it cannot be wrong, but at the same time, I don't want to say anything. So
Okay, fine. Okay, cool.
I can say my personal opinion, but I don't want to say it.
Okay, okay, don't say. Fine. So, come. So there's a story, like Kashi. Going back to the story part of it, there's a story in the. I'm guessing it's the Puranas where there is something about Shiva appearing as a column of fire and Vishnu becoming a boar and going to its feet and Brahma going to its head and they couldn't find him or something. Can you tell us that story? Do you remember that?
Sorry, I lost you there for a second,
Oh,
I guess.
okay. All right. So I can ask the question again. So
Mhm.
there's this story in the Puranas that I vaguely remember where Shiva appears as this big column of fire and Vishnu takes the form of a boar and he goes towards the feet to find where it's beginning and Brahma becomes a I don't know crow or something and goes towards the head and they can't
Mhm.
find the beginning or the end. Is that so? Can you tell us that story? What it is?
Yeah, that's exactly what the story is. In fact,
No, the background of it, like why does he appear and what's that going on?
so so every Purana has extols one of the energies or ideas or so this story comes from the Shiva Purana. So obviously when it's Shiva Purana, they say Shiva is the best and all the others are like no good kind of thing.
Yeah.
In a Vishnu Purana, you would find the converse happening and so on.
Mhm.
So in this story, it actually talks about, and Gurudev has spoken about it in a very beautiful way, says that Shiva is infinite. And to depict infinity, they said Brahma sat on his swan and flew up, and Vishnu became a boar and went down. The Vishnu never got to the end, so he came back and said, "Sorry, boss, no luck,
No
no
luck.
go."
Yeah.
And but Brahma said, "Well, I can't admit defeat." So he saw a flower falling down, and he caught the flower and said, "Are you coming from the head?" And the flower lied and said, "Yes, of course." Though Brahma knew that it was lie, he came back and said, "Hey, here's the evidence. This came from the head." And so then the story goes that uh, Shiva said, "Okay, Brahma, no one will worship you, and Vishnu, everyone will worship you." That kind of thing.
Oh, I see.
the the whole idea of that that story is to showcase that infinity cannot be really measured or cannot be gauged, but it can only be realized. And I think that is what is the beauty of the Eastern thought that could even conceptualize something like infinity, which again, like how Birjoo was saying, just some of these ideas, the fact that someone could have this idea is so fascinating. And for us, we take it for granted because we kind of are are brought up with these kind of ideas. But I'm sure when people are just counting on their fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and maths was so elementary, I think it was brilliant just to even conceptualize something like this.
Right. But so when I read this story and then many years later, oh, Birju, yeah, you want to say something?
No, continue. Yeah.
So when I read this story and many years later, I read about this thing called inflation that happened after the Big Bang. There was in my opinion, it was just a data fit, but it was a good concept where things just rapid expansion, way too fast for anything to even communicate with each other. And only then you could explain all this manifest universe that we see. And then I asked Birju about this, that tell me what is this inflation? This seems like it's the similar story that Shiva just massively expanded and Janta couldn't find its head or tail. Very loosey-goosey in my head, from the left to the right, I went and I said, oh man, this sounds like a similar story, this inflation business. Birju, what is inflation?
See, the danger of analogies is that it gives an illusion of knowing, but in reality it may not, it may cause more confusion.
Right.
So Shiva, if you see uh, the definition of Shiva, or it is something which is timeless, beyond time. Inflation is by definition something that happens within the purview of time, so it cannot be consistent with that. So, uh, uh, what is inflation? Inflation is is a model, phenomenological model, which is used to explain the observation that the universe is so big, and how did in the early universe here particles, antiparticles, everything in a soup? Why did it not just annihilate and just go home? That's it, finished. So suddenly at some point the space itself just stretched out very rapidly. That is the fudge factor or a scalar field which is needed in order to explain the evolution of the universe. And you can calculate various properties of this field, but what is the origin of this field we do not understand at this point. So inflation is a model which works, but we do not have a fundamental understanding of what it is. And there are many attempts. There are many the ideas that it's a gauge field, it's this, that. There were many theories that were tried or tested, but to really make it consistent with all else we know, that has not yet happened. And so going back to earlier things about string theory and all those things, one of my friends, one of my classmates actually, he worked on string cosmology in Cornell,
Mm-hmm.
and they couldn't. So they tried, like, they are not dishonest people, like they really want to explain but they cannot. So what happens is, then they came up with this idea of brains. So okay, instead of an inflation is a scalar field, and in string theory also there are scalar fields which you can attach it to different things and you can have. So there is something called Occam's razor, where when you try to explain a phenomenon, you want to use the most simplest set of models, set of ideas. If you go on complicating it, if you have if it's like with a polynomial, you can have anything. I can fit it. If you give me enough number of variables, I can fit anything. I
You
can
need
make it.
only five. To fit an elephant, you need only five variables. I can totally fit an elephant.
Right.
Yeah.
So inflation is the beauty of inflation is this simple model, one scalar field. That is the power of it.
That's the power, yeah.
That is why people still talk about it. Now, another thing I wanted to add before I forget, is going back to the thing about the negativity on the surface and positivity, etc. Even in our real world, real life, if you see what we call negative, what we call positive, it changes. It is not a fixed set thing. Fear is not fear. Say, okay, I'm afraid, anxious. But the same fear, if you don't have fear, you'll put your hand in fire, you'll burn down your house. What is negative, what is positive? I mean, if you say, oh, I have very enthusiasm, okay, I have a lot of enthusiasm. My director, recently, he was like, look, your greatest strength is your enthusiasm, and this is your greatest weakness, because you take up everything, you say yes to everything. Saying yes to something, is it a positive or a negative? We
Yes.
think it is a positive, but
Yes.
it can become a
Absolutely, yes.
negative in a professional environment where you have limited amount of time. You cannot take on and say yes to everything. So what is positive, what is negative? I mean, so in that sense, that analogy of the negativity being so, it's a good reassurance that whatever appears to be negative is only skin deep. It is not really true. It is not the nature. It is just a relative perception. It's just an appearance, which in reality, the core is something beautiful, powerful, enormous. All those things.
Right.
So that is the power of that analogy,
Right.
probably.
But it's a whole lot of nothingness, it turns out. I saw this beautiful video where there is a scale of 10. So they start at a leaf and then they
Powerful.
go scale of 10 above and a scale of 10 below. And for most of those transitions of 10, 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the minus 2, etc., there's a whole lot of nothingness there. Yeah, I'm saying, what is going on? There is a whole lot of nothing, which is making all this stuff appear very tangible. Like, what is going on?
We have all appreciated this concept a lot in the silence course. Introduction to art of living courses and art of silence. The first thing when it blew my mind when I came to Rishikesh, final year of physics. Actually, it was my fourth year of physics, and then Gurudev is like, it is hollow," and I'm like, yes, it is right. He knows. Yes, yes. It is. this is something fascinating, that most of what we see or know or hear or touch or taste and even imagine or think, it's, if we have this icons or this computer, wherever we are watching this, if the proton was of that size, the nearest electron would be miles away.
Yeah, exactly. So even yeah, on the other side, Kashi, you have the same things in the scriptures, right? There's a whole lot of nothingness, but yet there is a
And
lot of richness there.
yeah. So I would actually say that the whole idea is from nothingness came everything, and all of these ideas are very much present. Now, there is a tendency sometimes to say, hey, there's everything in the Vedas and modern science is nothing. But I don't really look at it that way. Uh, I would definitely say that instead of getting into one extreme of dogma or the other extreme of rejecting everything, I think the truth is somewhere in between. If we can use all these insights and come up with our own experience, I think that's the value of all these stories, of all these ideas that are promulgated in our ancient scriptures. So, in fact, one of the things says that take whatever makes sense and drop whatever doesn't. So I think that's where, uh, for many people, these shlokas, these concepts, ideas talked about can kindle some understanding of nature, and that is the value of all these scriptures.
Right.
And that's why all of this knowledge traditionally was always given with some kind of practice. So to achieve any of these ideas, to achieve an understanding or an experience of any of these concepts, you needed to meditate, you needed to do all kinds of practices, and that is
Yeah.
the path that we need to take to 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 make this our own knowledge. Otherwise it just becomes some words, something that we discuss in the drawing room and then go back to our own existence. I think the whole purpose of this knowledge and the tools to experience this knowledge is that we can travel on this path and make this knowledge our own experience. That's when it really becomes useful.
Yeah.
So I think that's why a lot of it was subjective. The objective part was the tools and the techniques, and the subjective part was the experience. And when I think the Orient was able to brilliantly marry both of them, and that's what allowed us to have such peaceful coexistence between science and spirituality.
Yeah. Very nice. Very nice.
It's like they were able to have an objective subjectivity, a subjectivity which is replicable. You can have a subjective, the whole replicability of science, repeatability. So you can have a subjective experience, and you can say, okay, can I make somebody else? So I can do something like a Sudarshan Kriya, or I can do Sahat Samadhi meditation. And can I replicate this experience to somebody who is an entirely somebody else, with a different set of experiences, a different set of backgrounds? How can we, how can I replicate this for them? And that is where they have mastered the whole insight into that. And that is just amazing, like what has happened, and especially what has survived through millennia. Now what has come to us, this is like priceless.
Yes, that is so very nice. Replicating a subjective experience. It's beautiful. Yes. So we are coming up on time. I know Kashi has a hard stop in 1 hour, so it's about that time now. But since we are running out of time, I'd like to seed an idea in both of your mind that the next session we do, we will talk about what is time. Since we are running out of it right now, we will put it to the next one. Because time
And
has
I
been
and I
fascinating.
believe you've already had some wonderful discussions already, Sandeep.
No, that was just the start of it, Kashi. We haven't got into why time, and because there is no reason for a linear time. Why can't I go back in time? I can go left, right, and up and down, but I can't go back. I can only go forward in time. So there must be a very nice reason for it. But since we're out of it now, we will table it for the next one.
There's more time.
There's more time. Yeah. So thank you very much for, Kashi, you're quite a busy guy and taking out 1 hour. Thank you very much. Birju, you woke up at 4:30 in the morning, dude. Thank you very much.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
All right. So I'll see
See
you
you.
guys next
Yeah.
time. Jai
We
Gurudev.
should
Bye.
have an